So in the last video, we introduced this little topic known as the production function. So what exactly is a production function? Well, the production function characterizes that physical relationship between the use of inputs and the level of outputs. So basically what the production function is going to do is it's going to take the level of inputs that we're at and actually tell us how much output that we're going to get. And there's a technical relationship there between the amount of inputs and the amount of outputs. And we know that this actually occurs, and it actually follows the same trend for virtually all inputs. And we're going to show you that trend. And what's coming up next is we're going to talk about the marginal physical product and how it will increase in an increasing rate and begin to increase at a decreasing rate and eventually begin to taper off. So before we get to that, let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about the production function, that technical relationship, and why it's important. So what if you sell fertilizer? What if you're a farm input supplier and you sell fertilizer? And a farmer comes up to you and they ask, how much fertilizer do you need to use? What are you going to say? Well, you're going to tell them, well, you need to use this much to make this much grow. Well, how do you know what those levels are? Well, that's what the production function is. The production function is going to look at the level of inputs that how much you put in and how much you should get out of it. So you're going to need to know that physical relationship between yield and the amount of fertilizer used, between the input and output relationship. So in a general case, the level of output may be a function of n number of identifiable inputs. So for example, output may be a function of quantity of input 1, or that variable input 1, or the input 1, quantity of input 2, all the way to quantity of input n. So what does that mean? Well, let's stop and think about, say, a cow-calf producer. Well, how much is a cow-calf producer going to produce? Well, it's going to depend on how much grass do they have. How much hay do they have? What kind of other inputs, like do they use implants and to try to increase growth? Do they use growth hormones? Something like that. Implants in cattle, do they castrate their calves? That's another input. How much labor are they going to put in? Are their facilities able to handle a larger amount of animals? There's a lot of different inputs that are all going to go into that. That's all going to affect output. So we can say, or another way of saying it, that output is a function of input 1, input 2, and all the way to input n that you use. So this formula right here is basically saying that output is a function of input 1, input 2, all the way to the total number of inputs that you're going to use. Now, these inputs are going to be different depending on different operations, right? So let's talk about a crop output in possibly the early 1880s, before a lot of technological advancements came out. So the amount of output that you produced was a function of labor, because that was an input, the amount of land that you used, the amount of seed that you used, a workhorse that you used, maybe a few basic implements, and then management. Because in the 1880s, early 1880s, that was really before fertilizer and a lot of precision agriculture and pesticides and herbicides really started coming onto the scene. So that could be left out. Well, it was more of a function of just land, labor, what kind of seed you use and how much. Did you have a workhorse? Did you have a few basic implements? And how are you going to manage that land? So a production function is a rule associated with an output to a given level of inputs used. So this production function, there's a rule that's associating with that level of output and the amount of inputs that are going to be used. So output is measured. Another thing we must know is that output is measured in physical units. So if you stop and think about output of bushels is measured, output of wheat is measured in bushels. Output of milk is measured in gallons. Output of calves in a cow-calf operation is measured in pounds. Output of feeder hogs or fed hogs or even lean hogs is measured in pounds. And depending on which operation you get into, all of output is always measured in some form of physical units. So now, are we going to, whenever we're dealing with these production functions, we want to see how something like just labor will affect our output. What if we kept labor or what if we kept land the same, the seed we use the same, that workhorse that we use the same, these few basic implements in management. Now, in real life, it makes it hard to keep a lot of these the same, but in economics, we're actually about to dive into a single input to a single output situation. So we're going to try and keep all of these the same, but only change the amount of labor to see how labor affects output. So if we change only one output and hold all the other inputs at a constant level, we can rewrite this equation. We're going to go ahead and rewrite this equation to where output is a function of labor, capital, land, and management. Remember, those are our 4 classifications of inputs. So we're going to try and see, we're going to run through some examples of how does output change if only labor changes. So we see this nice little line between labor and capital, this vertical line right here. If you ever see that vertical line in an equation, that line that's separating labor from the rest it indicates that only labor is going to be allowed to vary. We're going to keep capital, land, management are going to be all held at a constant level. So this is going to allow us to evaluate the relationship between just labor and just output. So basically, we're going to use this one input to see how that one input affects the level of outputs. What is the relationship between labor and output? And that's going to help us actually derive the production function for how much labor, that input to output relationship, that technical relationship between labor and that output.